Hey guys, welcome to PCA Distance Learning. This is World History, Chapter 26, New Global Patterns. This is Lesson 133 or Section 4, The Impact of Imperialism. All right, we've pretty much completed the month of March, the longest and in some ways the hardest month of the year. We're starting into April, and hopefully we'll see some warmer weather, make it a little easier to get outside and get a little exercise. All right, let's talk about some of the economic patterns that come from imperialism. And I want to start with a poem written by Rudyard Kipling. This is in your book on page 663. This is an extract from a larger work entitled The Ballad of East and West. Oh, the East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. But there is neither East nor West, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. And one of the things that I think is worth noting about Kipling here is that he's born in England. He's going to spend a portion of his life overseas in India, and he has experience with the non-Western world, and he isn't necessarily suggesting that birth and location make anyone better than anybody else. And I think that's particularly a good Christian perspective. All right. One of the things we're seeing as East and West are meeting economically is the increasing share of the earth that has gone to what we might call a money economy, moving away from barter and moving toward the use of coin. And certainly in our period of new imperialism from roughly 1870 to 1914, we see more of the world brought into this economic integration. It is led, we might say dominated, by the industrialized nations of the West, the British, the French, the Germans, the Belgians, the Americans. And certainly in the last decade, it's getting harder and harder to exclude Japan from being described as an industrialized nation. And those nations are sending out finished goods, investment capital, and their technology to other parts of the globe. Africa, much of Asia, and most of Latin America are sending back agricultural products, natural resources, and cheap labor. The West is going to gain a substantial profits. And the developing world experienced a greater rate of change as they saw new technologies brought into their countries. Instead of making goods by hand for local use, more and more they supplied products that were tied into an integrated world market. If we look on page 664, we see a picture of a coffee plantation. I apologize, that's 663. And what we see there is coffee being grown on the island of Java, which is today in Indonesia and was at that time usually referred to as the Dutch East Indies. And the caption under the section One Link in a Global Economy mentions that the coffee grown on that plantation might end up in an American or Dutch dining room, that the products of a fairly remote part of the world were connected to many more developed countries. Western capitalists operated plantations and mines and factories and relied on a steady supply of local labor. Colonial rulers often introduced a money economy that replaced local barter systems. Colonial authorities put taxes on people and required them to be paid in cash, not in kind. That is, with coin, not with goods. And to pay these taxes, at least in some places, local people were forced to find employment in various cash-paying jobs. And for some families, that meant that the men would be forced to leave their wives and children and migrate in search of employment, and that this pattern was not uncommon in southern and eastern Africa. Women were often left behind to grow food and raise the children. Now, one of the challenges I have here is to understand exactly how broad this pattern is, and I think the text gives us little in the way of statistics to say this applied to 50% or 5% of the developing world. Certainly it applies more to the Congo under Belgium than it does to India under the British. In Japan and Latin America, where obviously there are no direct colonial rulers, sons were usually kept home to farm, and daughters were more commonly sent off to cities to pick up jobs and then mail a portion of their wages back home. Now, that exchange pattern had both benefits and disadvantages to the local peoples involved. Mass-produced goods from the industrial world often disrupted traditional economies. Britain, for centuries, had imported cloth from India. Now, British factories ship cloth to India. Now, sort of begs the question, why did the Indian people buy British cloth rather than Indian cloth? There were no laws that required them to buy, for example, 10 square yards of cloth per household per year. It was a choice they freely and willingly made. Why did they do that? Well, the answer was the British cloth was well made and it was cheap. It was, in the eyes of Indian consumers, a better deal than locally produced cloth. Indian producers lost. Indian consumers gained. And in some ways, that's comparable to American shoppers in Walmart today buying Japanese-made goods because they appear to be a better deal than what are often more expensive American-made goods. All right, these local economies were much less likely to be isolated and more likely to be tied into the world economy. Locals bought finished goods and sold raw materials, and those prices would be affected by market swings in the world economy. They enjoyed an array of choices that had not been previously available, and I would argue that that provided a higher quality of life. Food production could be a double-edged sword. Western techniques almost invariably raised food production, but that often was accompanied by population increases, greater demands on the food supply, and foods sold on the world markets were not available for local consumption. And that meant, for example, in India, in a particular famine in the Deccan Plateau that took place in the beginning of the second half of the 19th century, farmers were shipping out food products to the British Empire when those products could have been usefully used right there in India. Excuse me, sorry. Now, I want to recognize that colonial rule usually brought some level of modernization, and that tended to bring certain economic benefits. Colonial powers almost always brought in more modern banking systems, and those would stimulate economic growth, making it much easier for aspiring businessmen to obtain capital for new ventures. Colonial powers introduced new technologies that made work easier and life more enjoyable. Colonial powers tended to build modern transportation and communication systems, and those usually included the telegraph, later the telephone, the creation or at least expansion of railroad systems, and modernization in the ports with winches and cranes and material to unload a ship more rapidly than would have been done previously. And certainly we can see these transportation and communication systems serving to integrate some of the larger colonial possessions, such as India under the British. And certainly as raw materials are shipped out and finished goods are brought in, a share of the locals will profit from those exchanges. Those that are connected to distributing Western goods often benefited substantially. And a factor that seemed to appear all too frequently in developing worlds is that those in local government often took a personal slice of wealth right off the top of the national treasuries. An attitude that seemed to be endemic to many of the local cultures. All right, how does imperialism affect cultures? And a part of that is westernization, the process of looking more and acting more like the West. Certainly, most Europeans believe their culture was better than what they were running into around the globe. Now, the West was not unique in that sense of cultural pride at all. Certainly, China and Japan believed that their culture was the best in the world. So this is not something that's unique to European or American thought. Westerners press locals to accept their culture, at least as far as many modern ways, organizing a government, using new technology. And for most observers, modernization and westernization were synonyms. They meant the same thing. Japan might be a major exception where aspects of Western culture were accepted while elements of Japanese culture would be effectively retained. Many locals saw Westerners as victorious, as superior, and basically copied them wholesale. Local elites learned Western languages and wore Western clothing and adopted Western manners. A second group resented Western changes, and a third and smaller group tried to pick and choose. I think if we look at the picture on 665, we see a Frenchman in French Indochina, modern-day Laos, meeting with the local monarch. And when you look at his clothing, the hat and the gown look very traditional. Certainly those shoes appear to be Western in style. And if there is a fourth group here, we have those that support Western ideas, those that oppose, those that want to pick and choose. And the fourth group is those that are just not connected at all. And certainly there are a few who are left in remote parts of Africa and the Middle East and Latin America that have virtually no contact with outsiders. One of the cultural impacts of imperialism will be brought in by missionaries. And missionaries often appeared on the scene before there was any sort of colonial government per se. These are folks coming over as individuals. And in many cases, they will establish schools which teach basic literacy and provide young men, especially the children of elites, with the skills for connections in both business and in government. Along with schools, we see hospitals, and Western medicine brought many benefits, including vaccines against particular diseases and improved hygiene that saved many lives. When it comes to the religious side, the connection between missionaries and imperialism is rather complex. Many missionaries operated outside any sort of colonial government support, arriving before governments were established, or in some cases in areas that were never claimed by the metropole or sending mother country. In colonies controlled by Protestant countries, missionaries were usually tolerated but not required. The one imperial power that I am aware actually sent missionaries as part of government policy was France in Southeast Asia, in modern-day Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. We can probably say this with a fair degree of confidence, that Christianity had greater success where the locals were animists that believed in more primitive spirits than when they were Buddhist or Confucian or Hindu or Muslim. Certainly, cultural exchange would impact various local patterns in areas under colonial control. The West, in some cases, was very critical of particular local traditions. Sati in India, the burning of widows, and that seemed especially inappropriate in the case of child marriages, where you might have had a 50-year-old marrying a 5-year-old and then putting a 10-year-old on the husband's funeral pyre shortly thereafter. Foot binding in China is another case of seeing missionaries come in and British merchants come in and express discomfort, displeasure with this particular Chinese pattern. And in some cases, we're talking about criticisms. Foot binding, in other cases, we're talking about illegality, sati. Indians will live under British laws against sati for perhaps 120 years, and it will not reemerge after independence occurs right after World War II. China will associate foot binding with the dynastic tradition, particularly the Qing, and that will become less attractive in the late 19th century as opposition to the Qing dynasty increases. And it will be outlawed on several occasions under the New Republic in 1912, perhaps not effectively, but Mao Zedong and the People's Republic of China will renew laws against foot binding in 1949, and it has virtually disappeared from China since then. The non-European world will experience modernization after Europe went through their own process, and the locals will face a choice as to how much modernization will look like westernization. I think your book on pages 665, 666 has a quote from a Nigerian who is torn between the comfortable traditions of his village and the exciting amenities of modern city life. Now, I want to recognize that this is a two-way street, that just as Western culture will impact the developing world in turn will impact Western culture. And we can see this perhaps as a continuation of the Columbian Exchange that was started back in 1492. Europeans were increasingly likely to consume products from Africa and Asia and Latin America. European diets would include bananas and coffee and pineapples. Rubber from the Congo and Southeast Asia and Latin America would provide wheels for bicycles and automobiles and even airplanes. Western artists would take inspiration from foreign contact. Pablo Picasso would use experiences with Africa. Paul Gauguin will paint natives in Tahiti. I think on page 666 we see a picture there of both the masks that are connected to Picasso and all of that is Picasso. That doesn't particularly have a connection to Gauguin and Tahiti, sorry. James McNeill Whistler, an American painter, certainly did a number of pictures involving some of the imported goods and clothing that Americans were bringing back from China. European scholarship will explore foreign lands and in some cases contribute to the world's body of knowledge by uncovering evidence of ancient cultures. The German Heinrich Schliemann will excavate near Hisarlik, Turkey, and he will validate the existence of the ancient city of Troy that had been written about by Homer in the Trojan War. And some people had believed, having lost track of this ancient city, that it was simply a mere fable. And Schliemann made clear that there really was such an ancient city. His excavations took place in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And then about 40 years later, British Mortimer Wheeler will excavate the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan to validate the existence of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And certainly that was something that was new to the Western world. All right, let's finish today taking a look at some of the political tensions that begin to arise as East is meeting West. And want to recognize that imperialism has political consequences that were global in nature. As Europeans claimed and conquered large empires in Africa and Asia, they rather severely disrupted the existing political entities. In some cases, that was tribes. In some cases, that was kingdoms. But new borders were imposed that often had nothing to do with existing ethnic groups or languages. So they would split some people apart and group others together who had no real previous natural connections. One aspect of imperialism is that it threatened to provoke conflict among the imperial powers. Probably most famously, the British all-red route running north and south from Egypt down to South Africa came in contact with the French east-west route, and we saw competition for control of the Nile River, lead to a crisis at Fashoda in modern-day Sudan in 1898, where Britain and France were literally on the edge of war with each other. Imperialism is sometimes cited as a cause of the First World War. It's probably worth noting that Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, the friendly understanding, in 1904. This is about 6 years after the crisis at Fashoda, and that would resolve their existing colonial tensions. Britain and Russia had also competed for influence in Asia, what was sometimes called the Great Game, in Persia and Afghanistan and Tibet. And there will be an Anglo-Russian entente in 1907, so that Britain and Russia are also able to bury the hatchet over colonial issues and ultimately pave the way for those three to all be on the Allied powers in World War I. Your book notes that France and Germany almost fought over crises in Morocco. The first one would be in 1905, the second one in 1911. And I think that that's true, but I would also suggest that the German possession of Alsace and Lorraine is the real heart of their conflict and means that both sides are much more likely to blow up issues that really don't start with colonialism. The personality of Wilhelm II, who has both an inferiority complex and a belief that Germany should be the most significant nation in Europe, and his desire to pursue what some historians called Weltpolitik, or a world policy like his grandmother Victoria's England, to develop a navy, to develop colonies, pushes him toward conflict. A different leader, his father Wilhelm I, didn't have those problems. All right, let's finish today taking a look at resistance to Western rule, and that will take a number of forms. Initially, it was usually military action. Various local entities, often kingdoms, on occasion won battles. The Zulus beat the British at Isandlwana. The Sudanese beat the British at Khartoum. Now, it goes without saying that the British didn't lose any of their colonial wars. So, winning a battle, the British reloaded, sent another expedition, and Isandlwana was replaced by Ulundi. Khartoum was replaced by Omdurman, and the British ended up victorious in both of those conflicts. The one single case of a local power beating a European power in a war rather than a single battle would have been the Ethiopians, who win the Battle of Adowa against Italy, and Italy is not willing to try again to conquer the Ethiopians in their mountain strongholds. The Muslim world often called for internal reform to, in effect, get more Muslim and practice a purer form of Islam. Certainly, the Mahdi in Sudan was one of those Islamic reformers. A second wave of resistance to the West would be based on elites born under Western rule who had had a Western education. And we'll see this pattern emerge in India with the Indian National Congress and a later offshoot known as the Muslim League. The European powers are going to be able to run roughshod over resistance down until World War I. And I think we want to see the period of 1914 to 1918 as a real watershed with regard to imperialism, Europe's ability to project power in faraway places. The West will lose population, the millions that are killed in the wars. The West will lose wealth, hundreds of billions that are spent, the need to spend billions more on repairs. And the West will lose a sense of moral certainty. Many Europeans inherently believed in the 1870s and 80s and 90s that their culture was better than other cultures. And certainly with regard to education and health and technology, it probably was. But there was a sense that that culture had gotten some major things wrong. And it's very hard to argue against the sense that after World War I, the gap between Europe and the developing world had really closed down. Europe's going to stay in control in what we might call the interwar years of the 1920s and 1930s. But we're going to see a very similar process in 1939 to 1945, and that European lead will virtually entirely disappear. And many colonial movements for independence will emerge after World War II, and most of them will gain success. We reach what is often called the end of empire, and the British particularly, who had the biggest, but the French and other European powers begin to retreat from many of the locations that they had taken control of around the globe. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 26, and now I've got to come up with some sort of assessment. Hey, go forth, do great and wonderful things. God bless.